Hello friends, this is Krishna Vasist and you are listening to me on your favorite channel Tats Guru. So again we are going to do a important video session, and that video session will be regarding about present indefinite tense. And in this video session I'm gonna tell you I, my, you, your concept. And at the end of the video that I will teach you why don't you. Why don't you is a kind of phrase that if you practice a lot on that phrase, that you will have many sentences, you can form many sentences, and definitely you would love, okay, about this phrase. And this is a kind of practice session. This video is fifth. It means we have covered 4 video session in past. So if you have not watched those great lessons, please go on Tats Guru channel and find them, because those videos are fantastic. Absolutely, you definitely like those videos. Okay, so now friends, let's get started and let's get to the first slide, very first slide that you can see on my screen. I accept my mistake. And friends, if you wanna learn how to speak English in very short time, so you will have to speak a sentence loudly, okay, loudly every time. Okay, something like that. If I pronounce like I accept my mistake, I accept my mistake, I accept my mistake, this is a sentence, and you speak in this way, I accept my mistake. And many times if you try to speak it, do it many times, I accept my mistake. Friends, speak with me, I accept my mistake. Okay, I accept my mistake. And if you speak in this way, suppose second sentence, you accept your mistake, you accept your mistake. So friend, observe about 2 words here, I and my. Whenever you use I, you will have to use my. Okay, suppose I accept my mistake, I accept my mistake. Okay, and in the second sentence, you accept your mistake, you accept your mistake. You know, it is a kind of possession that you are showing in these 2 sentences, I accept. And whose mistake is this? It is yours. So it means you will have to use my. Okay, this is my book. Okay, this book is mine. Even you can say I accept my mistake, you accept your mistake. Okay, whenever you use you, and you are trying to do think that this is mine, this is mine, this is yours, this is yours, this is mine, so you will have to use your. You know, whenever you are approaching something towards, okay, that you will have to say your. Okay, so just try to learn in this way, I accept my mistake. This is a present action that you are approaching, that you are saying I accept my mistake. Think about when you are just saying these lines in front of somebody. You know, you are just talking with someone, and that you will have to use I accept my mistake. Okay, I accept my mistake, you accept your mistake. And we accept our mistake, we accept our mistake. So this is a we, and we are using our. This is you, and we are using your. This is I, and this is your, not your. Okay, because in last video that I told you, you will have to think about your pronunciation as well, because pronunciation is must. You cannot pronounce any wrong word, because if you're pronouncing a wrong word, okay, so your accent, you will be habitual for that with that. Okay, so just take care of your pronunciation, because it is really important. I accept my mistake, you accept your mistake, we accept our mistake. Just think about. Okay, they accept their mistake. Whenever you use they, okay, so you'll have to use their. Okay, they accept their mistake, they accept their mistake, they accept their mistake. I accept my mistake, you accept your mistake, we accept our mistake, they accept their mistake. Got it? Now, boys accept their mistake. Boys, okay, boys accept their mistake. So there are number of boy, actually, we are using s behind boy. Boys accept their mistake. So this is a kind of, we can say, this is a kind of plural in English. Boys accept their mistake. Okay, boys accept their mistake. Suppose if there was girls, so again you will have to use their. Girls accept their mistake. Just try to make many sentences from yourself, because this is very important. As much as you can make any sentences, you have to take care about your pronunciation, because this is also very important at the time. And whenever you write any sentence, whenever you see any sentence on the present indefinite tense, that you will have to speak it, you will have to speak it loudly. Okay, and just use your tongue, just twist your tongue. Okay, when it comes to pronounce a word. Boys accept their mistake. Next, he accepts his mistake. He accepts his mistake. So I'm using he this time, and after accept, that I'm using s. You have to take care of s and es. S and es, that I told you in previous videos. Okay, whenever I use he, she, it, or any singular kind of person like Sham, Ram, Sita, Gita, so you will have to use s or es. You will have to take care of s or es. He accepts his mistake. He accepts his mistake. Just try to speak it many times. He accepts his mistake. He accepts his mistake. He accepts his mistake. Accepts mean, what does it mean about accept? Accept means svikar karna. Okay, he accepts his mistake. He accepts his mistake. She accepts her mistake. She accepts her mistake. Okay, whenever we use he, then we'll have to use his with he. And whenever we approaching towards a girl, that we use her for that. She accepts her mistakes. She accepts her mistake. So in grammar, that we call them pronoun. Okay, I, my, he, she, his, her, these are some pronoun. Okay, but you really don't need to take care of the pronoun, the grammar, what is that, what is this. You just go with sentence and pronounce it as much as accurately, as much as you can. She accepts her mistake. Manoj, now this is a singular. Manoj accepts his mistake. Manoj accepts his mistake. Manoj accepts his mistake. Okay, so once again, I accept my mistake, you accept your mistake, we accept our mistake, they accept their mistake, boys accepts their mistake, he accepts his mistake, she accepts her mistake, Manoj accepts his mistake. Got it? So this is a kind of speaking drill that you'll have to use again and again every day, that you will, at the end of the day, you will learn these phrases all together. Okay, so you don't need to take care about your grammar. What is grammar? It is nothing, but just try to learn in this way, because this is very very important to do that if you want to speak English. Okay, so now let's go to the next slide. He accepts his mistake again. She accepts her mistake. Manoj accepts his mistake. Manoj accepts his mistake. Sita accepts her mistake. Sita accepts her mistake. Okay, like you can make many sentences like I eat my pizza, you eat your pizza. Okay, we eat our pizza, this is our, something like this is our, not our, this is our. We eat our pizza. He eats, you just take care about eats. You eats, sorry, he eats his pizza. Let me get to the a blank slide. Let me create it first. He eats, he eats, he eats, he eats, she eats, he eats, she eats. Okay, he eats his pizza. He eats his pizza. She eats, she eats her pizza. Okay, just try to get the concept, friends. If you are using he, then for the possession that you will have to use his. He and his, she and her all together. If you are saying about he or she, then you will have to use s or es. You will have to take care about s or es. So this is a kind of practice that I'm teaching you, and just you will have to speak it with me. Okay, he eats his pizza, she eats her pizza. Now it goes, it goes, it goes. Again, he goes, he goes, he goes, he goes, he goes, he goes. And if you do in this way, he go, your mind will catch it instantly. You are doing some mistake, so you got to remove your mistake. Okay, he go, it is nothing, actually he goes, he goes. Ram goes his place. Ram goes his, because Ram is a male, you'll have to use his. Ram goes his place. Ram goes his place. Ram goes his place. Ram goes his place. Priyanka goes her place. Priyanka goes her place. Priyanka goes her place. Okay, just you will have to use practice. You will have to do practice. This is very important to do that. And it is not like that if you are writing Hindi sentences and you are converting those Hindi sentences into English sentences, that's not good. Okay, I have observed that if you do practice in this way, that I am making you people, so that would be great, that would be well for you. Okay, and you can learn it in very short interval of time. Okay, you will not take much time to learn. So again, so now the next one is why don't you. This is a kind of phrase that I was really excited to teach you. Why don't you? This is a phrase, friends. Actually, this is an interrogative sentence in present indefinite tense. So if you use why don't you, if I say why don't you do that work, why don't you do that work, why don't you do that work, it means to तुम वो काम क्यों नहीं करते हो, तुम पिज़्ज़ा क्यों नहीं खाते हो, तुम वहाँ क्यों नहीं जाते हो, something like that. Just got it. Why don't you do that work, why don't you do that work? And this is a kind of phrase, friends, that I use it oftenly. Okay, why don't you do that, why don't you do that? And just I learned it in this way. Why don't you do that, why don't you do that, why don't you do that? Just try to say in one go. Why don't you do that, 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 why don't you do that? It is not possible because we are not a native speaker. So we fumble sometime, we make a mistake. So that will be great if we learn from our mistake. Okay, why don't you do that, why don't you drink tea, why don't you drink tea, why don't you, this is again same line that you will have to remember. Why don't you? So this will be changing again and again. Why don't you drink tea, 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 why don't you drink milk, why don't you drink Pepsi, why don't you drink tea, why don't you drink tea, why don't you drink water, why don't you drink water? Suppose you are welcoming a guest. He suddenly, a guest comes to your home. No, guest come at your home, that I would say. And you just took glass of water for him, and just you kept on a table, and that guest, he is not drinking a water. Okay, he has not taken yet. So you would say, why don't you drink water, why don't you drink water, why don't you drink water? There is a hot outside, there is a hot weather, why don't you drink water, why don't you drink water? No, that's not cold, that's warm. Why don't you drink tea, why don't you drink tea, why don't you drink tea, why don't you drink tea? And same goes with tea. Same goes with tea. Why don't you drink tea? Why don't you eat pizza, why don't you eat pizza? Suppose very next moment that you came to the kitchen, and you came back, and just you were hanging with pizza. You have your pizza, and just you kept pizza on a table in front of them, and they are talking to you, they are not eating anything. You can say, why don't you eat pizza, why don't you eat pizza? You can say to that guest, why don't you eat pizza, why don't you eat pizza? Why? Again, why don't you use the same line? Again, why don't you use the same line? Why don't you eat pizza? Okay, this will be changing again and again. Why don't you eat pizza, why don't you eat pizza? Why don't you eat cake, why don't you eat cake? Why don't you eat cake, why don't you eat cake? Why don't you eat cake? Why don't you eat pizza? Why don't you drink tea? Why don't you eat pizza? Okay, so friend, this is a practice. Okay, I hope you are enjoying my lesson, this video session you are enjoying. Again, give me some time, I'm searching. There is a slide left. Why don't you utilize your time? Why don't you utilize your time? Suppose you are a father, and you can say this to your son. Why don't you utilize your time? Why don't you utilize your time? Why don't you utilize your time? आप अपना टाइम यूटिलाइज क्यों नहीं करते? यूटिलाइज का मतलब just to make something out of free time. Why don't you utilize your time? Okay, just do something. Why don't you utilize your time? 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 Why don't you study? Why don't you study? Why don't you study? Again, why don't you same, and study is different here. Why don't you study? तुम क्यों नहीं पढ़ते हो? Why don't you study? Why don't you study? Why don't you study? Why don't you go there? Why don't you go there? Why don't you go there? Why don't you sit? Why don't you stand? Why don't you dance? Why don't you drink? Why don't you eat? Why don't you sleep? You can make many sentence. Okay, why don't you, this is again very important phrase. Nobody would tell you, why don't you take bath? 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 You can even say shower. Why don't you take shower? 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 Why don't you put your shirts? You are naked. Why don't you put your shirt? Why don't you put shirt? Why don't you put shirt? Why don't you put your shirt? Sorry. Why don't you put your shirt? Why don't you put your shirt? Why don't you watch TV? Why don't you watch TV? Why don't you operate your mobile? Why don't you operate your mobile? Somebody asking a mobile from you, and you can say, why don't you operate your mobile? Why don't you use your mobile? You can say, why don't you use your mobile? Why don't you use your mobile? Why don't you use your mobile? Okay. Why don't you utilize your time? Why don't you utilize your time? Why don't you watch TV? 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 Why don't you study? Why don't you take bath? Okay. Why don't you drive? Why don't you drive? Why don't you drive? Why don't you drive? Why don't you play? Why don't you play? Why don't you stand? Okay, friend, so this is the video session that I took for you, and I hope you must have got the concept well. And if you have any query, you can ask me anytime. You can comment me, and definitely I'll give a reply to you. And hopefully that we have completed 5 lessons so far in case of present indefinite tense. I hope you have got the concept. Okay, so thank you very much for watching this lesson, and again I'll come up with the great lesson. Okay, so take care, bye bye, see you then. Thank you.